Good evening and welcome to Zion's Banner. Um, Already see some people here, kind of our special pre-Thanksgiving broadcast. And so I want to go ahead and give thanks. I'm going to do a special broadcast based on a unique opportunity I had. So we're going to jump in. Now, tomorrow night, there's going to be no broadcast in the regular sense. I'm going to post some Thanksgiving greetings, probably before turkey coma and after potential workout. And so I am very much looking forward to spending the day with my family. And I hope that you get the chance to spend the day with yours and really enjoy the blessings that we enjoy in America, some of which people in other nations don't even enjoy. I'm going to jump into things. It's going to be a different sort of program, so I don't know quite how things are going to go. But I'm going to share some experiences too. So, in a sense, this may be a little bit more personal, which is kind of neat. And I think I can get a little personal around this topic. By the way, if you've never read any of the blogs, my website, Zion's Banner, has blogs. And so that is a possibility for you. And some of the thoughts in this will probably appear in the blog. So there'll probably be a few others that join us. And then there'll be some people that are just enjoying Thanksgiving a little early. Let's dig into it. So I'm going to switch out. There we go. By the way, this platform for OBS really is a lot better. And I'm really pleased with it because it's a lot stabler, which is great. So, boy, I love it when you guys greet me. I don't, I always feel funny because we have our little community, but I know that my desire is to get this material out, and I always wonder what it's like for others watching. We're going to see what we can learn from C.S. Lewis tonight. And this really comes out of a kind of a personal thing that happened with us. Our wedding anniversary happened, and so we were given a very special gift. And interestingly enough, that gift which tied in to C.S. Lewis tied into when we got it in terms of the anniversary of his death, which I will say again, I took a little video clip right where we were when we were there. Let's talk about C.S. Lewis's birth. We'll talk more about his background, but just so that you know, he was born on the 29th of November, 1998. Now, you will notice that it says 29 November 1998. That's the way it's written in Europe. We in America put the month first, then the date, and then the year. They don't do that in Europe. They put the day and then the month and then the year. So, honoring C.S. Lewis's background, I went with the European way. Um, so, um, let's get into what I got. Now, I still have these CDs. I'm going to have you hear the clip. I did this at the theater, which was really cool. So I'm going to go ahead and clip on this. So we were at a special evening with C.S. Lewis. A gentleman does a one-man show portraying C.S. Lewis. See, tonight is the anniversary of C.S. Lewis' death, so he will not make it this evening. But this was a gift from my daughter. In fact, we had a wonderful dinner out and are enjoying a wonderful evening. It's a precious gift from our dear daughter. And so my wife even said, why don't you do your YouTube apologetics broadcast Wednesday before Thanksgiving, which would be very appropriate to give thanks for the way that God used this particular gentleman to go ahead and really present the Christian worldview as far as the existence of God and key doctrines of Christianity. Mere Christianity is still selling today, and look at some of those key arguments and interact with them. And so I'm really thinking of doing that. But the real joy is that I get to listen to one of my a gentleman who is an apologist and a writer and contributed to English literature
in the sense of seeing someone play him. And I've always appreciated Lewis as an apologist and a writer. And so this is a rare treat. I'm going to go and join my wife now, but this is really exciting for me. And so although I can't see C.S. Lewis live until I get to heaven, I can enjoy seeing a gentleman discuss his life, playing him as if I was there with him. And I am kind of certain that this gentleman will do an incredible job. So I'm going to go for now, but I had to put this post up, and it gave me ideas for Wednesday's apologetics broadcast. So I'm really kind of excited with that. My wife's looking over the merchandise, and there are two things that go through my mind. One, I'd like some input into that, and two, should I go over there and see what's going on? So I'm going to switch this around just for a second here. Whoop. There we go, and we're at the Mesa Arts Center. And this is going to be a fun evening and exciting and a real blessing from God. And so that's about it for now as we get ready to go into the show. And I get to watch someone play someone whose writings I have deeply appreciated.
Okay, I'm back on. I know that there's a little bit. You're looking at the Mesa Arts Center and just finishing up their camera shot of the corridor we were at. Okay, looks like the camera stopped moving. Now, just jokingly, just a little bit of humor here. I now have video evidence that I do listen to my wife. Just because she suggested the broadcast. And the more I got prepared for this broadcast, the more I got excited. And the more it really came together as I started to pull from my library. So it was one of those things where I thought, is this going to work? And then, like, it really sort of came together. On the left side, you'll see the 2 DVDs they were giving away. They also work and give part of the proceeds to a charity. And if you indeed sponsored a child for a year, you got all 3 of the CDs. So this gentleman isn't just in this for himself. He actually uses it to raise money for a ministry, which I thought was absolutely beautiful. I got the C.S. Lewis presentation that he did on DVD, and then I got a presentation he did with another gentleman, where they're basically doing kind of a thing where him and Tolkien are together. And Tolkien and him were friends and had a deep, abiding friendship over a lot of years. And we'll talk more about that. But basically, that's him and Tolkien sitting at the English pub having some time together. I have yet to view that. And by the way, my daughter might really enjoy viewing one of these or both of these. She actually has a degree in English literature, and they did some study on these particular authors. And so I will pass the thank yous to my wife. And let's get to it, because if this doesn't turn out so well, there'll be less thank you to go around. Let's talk about his early childhood. Now, I wasn't there for it. This gentleman did an excellent job of portraying this in the first person. That's really hard to do. We had to do a sermon as a biblical character when I was in preaching class, and it is really difficult to do. And he did a wonderful job with it. One of the first things he discussed was the loss of his mother. And the death of C.S. Lewis's mother really had a profound effect on Lewis. He mentioned that he was brought up in the Protestant Church of Ireland as opposed to being an Irish Catholic. The death of his mother brought him face to face with evil and loss in the world. And that plagued him. The house was not the same, the author pointed out. And if you look at Lewis's diaries and some of that material, you will see how profoundly this death had an effect on Lewis in particular. And so the actor relayed that as personally as he could. Now, the material I read on Lewis's life did not relay that as much as this actor pointed that out. But I think it was a formative thing in Lewis's life. Um, it was especially pointed out that Lewis's dad wasn't somebody he disliked completely, but he was somebody that wasn't around a lot. And so Lewis's main parental figure was indeed his mom. And so that had an effect. He was brought up in the Protestant church, but given the loss of his mother, and what the writer here, who did the biography, uh, Tears Van, I can't even pronounce it, Pettinger, by the way, from Oxford, who did bibliographies online, says that the boringness of the services and the problem of evil in the world really caused Lewis to lose his faith. Now, I want to be clear about this. Lewis doesn't claim an evangelical faith until later in his life. So I'm a little disappointed with the wording there because Lewis didn't lose his faith. You don't lose Jesus, and Jesus doesn't lose you. You're going to see a prejudice on my part that I think is a sound theological prejudice. See, isn't that funny how I can use the word that way? Is a strong theological position that God keeps those he saves. But what I will say is that Lewis lost um, the handed down faith that was given to him through his experiences in the Protestant church. In other words, his social Christianity or his being Christianized peeled off. And so I'm going to make some editorial comments on that. I don't even think Lewis says he had faith. Lewis will say he has faith later on. So I'm even discussing that. Um, in fact, the account of his conversion, which is mentioned by somebody right on right now, surprised by joy. Um, And so, but you need to understand. Now, he told a story that soon after his mother's death, he was sent to boarding school, very typical uh, in England. And so, Warney, his brother, um, was sent to boarding school, but they weren't sent to the same boarding school. He had another name for Warney. It was extremely funny and humorous, but I don't know that it's fit consumption for YouTube. But it is extremely funny. They had an interesting relationship, but he was sent to boarding school, and he had an atheistic professor there that he struck up a relationship with. And the English like to give these kind of funny nicknames to people. And so I don't know what they called him because it seemed really strange to me. We probably would not address a professor that way, but as I watch things like Worcester and Jeeves, which is P.T. Warhouse, the English seem to thrive on some of these interesting nicknames. And so I can't give you the professor's name, even though I heard it at the performance, because it just kind of washed over me as I was listening to this individual literally take on the persona of C.S. Lewis. But the story I will always remember, this professor was an atheist. He was extremely logical and extremely rational as far as being a thinker. I don't think atheism itself is all that rational or logical, but there are very logical and rational people that hold to that position without necessarily seeing the inconsistencies in it. And Lewis pointed out one of the inconsistencies. He said one of the funny things about atheists is they don't believe in God, that God exists, and they're terribly mad at him for not existing, which I thought was a very funny line and certainly worthy of the actual Lewis. He said this professor was fascinating to him because he had only one really kind of weird, quirky thing. He would get dressed on Sunday in his best clothes and go do his gardening because he obviously didn't go to church. And so, what was really strange about that to him was he once went to this professor and said, "Well, why in the world do you dress up on Sunday?" And the professor's response was, even though I don't believe in God, there's no reason I shouldn't respect him. And so I thought that was just a really humorous story and the type of story that Lewis would seize on. And I couldn't help but get kind of a chuckle out of it. Um, that it was even in this atheism, there was an inconsistency that was fairly glaring. He moved on from that story and then discussed the fact that after boarding school, he ended up being involved in the war. Now, so was Tolkien, and the war molded both of those men very uniquely. And you can see the effect of Tolkien on the effect of the war had on Tolkien in his novels. Um, he ended up being involved in the war, and he, right before the end of the war, almost got killed. In fact, if one of his fellow soldiers, I think it was his superior officer, had not stepped in front of him and taken the shell, and he died, Lewis would not be alive, but there was enough shrapnel to injure him. And so he was sent home to recuperate from his injuries. During the period of convalescence, he ended up, the war ended up ending, and so he did not have to go back. He became friendly with a Mrs. Moore. Now, this actor did not discuss Mrs. Moore, which was the mother of a close army buddy named Edward Paddy Moore, and he remained close to Mrs. Moore, often referring to her as mother, until her death in 1940. Now, the actor said very little about this particular relationship, probably because the actor was drawing the biography out for us to understand Lewis's faith better. And Mrs. Moore didn't probably play a large part in that faith. But it was a worthy part of his biography, given that Lewis had lost his mother, that there came into his life another mom type figure. Um, this is also from the biography of Lewis. Now, I did not get these things directly from Lewis's books because I would have had to scan him, although there will be references to his books when we look at his theology. And I have a credible source for that, and he will actually reference the exact books and page numbers. So you will have that available to you if you download the PowerPoint, which I am glad for you to have. Happy Thanksgiving and Merry Christmas. That is yours like all the others are. Um, let's kind of move on, okay? Lewis goes from his convalescing in the end of the war to Oxford, where he completes his education and degrees before taking up a post teaching English uh, at Magdalene College, associated with Oxford. He actually took the position of a tutor and then became a professor, and then I guess a tenured professor is the way you'd put it. He taught there from 1925 to 1954. Um, And so he had quite a stint teaching. In fact, that's the only place that he really teaches. Um, and so that's where he continues his career. Um, and so that's kind of what ends up happening there. He doesn't start as a professor of medieval literature, he actually starts as an English tutor. He told the story of one of his lazier students, the actor did. Again, uh, do I know Lewis's letters well enough? By the way, Lewis wrote people back that wrote him, so we have a prolific amount of material not only in his writings but also in his letters and correspondence. So it's highly possible that in his letters and correspondence, Lewis did indeed relate some of these stories that don't even appear in Surprised by Joy in some of his books, given the personal nature of them. And so my daughter would actually be even better with that, having studied Lewis. By the way, there are now degrees in English Lit Lewisology, or Lewis's writings. And so now this becomes important because this is where he's going to meet some critical people in his life that are going to be critical to his writing, but also critical to him coming to faith. He forms a close friendship with some others at Oxford, which included J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, Owen Barfield, and they formed an informal group, which, if you've read Lewis's writings, you know about, called the Inklings. They would meet at a local bar, and they got into the custom of reading their working projects to each other. That's really the basis for the other DVD. Lewis and Tolkien are sitting there reading their works to each other at the local bar, uh, and they met in pubs. One of their favorites was the Eagle and Child, just so you can get a flavor of fish and chips and that whole thing. Um, it is Lewis that encouraged Tolkien to write his epic Lord of the Rings. Now, what's significant about that is that Lewis's real love was language. He was a philologist. He also loved Icelandic or Norse myth, which was a common interest for both him and Lewis. Now, I know Lewis took interest in Celtic myth also, but their common interest was Nordic myth. And so Tolkien loved language and he loved the epics, the Icelandic and Norse epics. And so they kind of struck it up. He started on this project to create a fantasy world and fantasy storyline for these languages that he had started to develop. Um, and so he encourages Tolkien, who didn't think much of this material, to actually go ahead and try to publish Lord of the Rings. So not only are we indebted to Lewis for his own writings, but we're indebted to Lewis for the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien that are also still influencing culture. Now, I have to let you in on something that my daughter will point out to me regularly, having an English Lynn court and talked about them. Tolkien hated allegory. Lewis didn't. So if you're watching the Lord of the Rings movies and decide to binge on them this Thanksgiving as you're slipping into turkey coma, understand that Tolkien never meant it to be an allegory. The hysterical thing is, sometimes what we don't mean to happen, things slip out, and you can see some elements that are allegorical like. But if I ever say that this is an allegory, my daughter, who is has an incredible mind, and we have many great philosophical and theological discussions, and she's even kind of had a hand in editing some of my dissertation stuff. She will jump on me and say, "Dad, it's not allegory." And so I'm not afraid to learn from my children. Uh, somewhat I really enjoy this. In our house, we love the banter. We love the intellectual stimulation. And so that's just a little bit of background there. Let's keep moving on. Um, Now, coming to personal faith was a process. Lewis had slipped into an atheism. He wouldn't say he was a militant atheist, but he would say that he was a convinced atheist. And so, if you read Surprised by Joy, he relates his coming to faith. Let me kind of go ahead. Now, we started out with him actually being raised in the Protestant Church of Ireland. Um, but he loses that faith. He slips into atheism. Returning to Oxford, he becomes increasingly perplexed by the existence of God and Christianity. Now, the two figures that are going to have a real powerful impact on him are our J.R.R. Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, a name that you've probably not heard much about. Um, these two individuals really kind of challenge C.S. Lewis's atheism, and I know that there are a lot of other folks here, and it didn't need to be all about Lewis's conversion. The actor did a very good job of portraying that, but he didn't go into some of the details. Um, we're going to look at two of Tolkien's apologetic contributions that I think are really significant. Um, but he had evening chats with these two. He's finally converted to a belief in God theism before Christianity. Now, if you're looking at the slide, he leaves behind atheism in 1929. He states that he was surprised by the joy of finding Christ in 1931. Now, he wouldn't use that exact language. He said he was the most reluctant convert in all of England. He starts by coming to the conclusion that really his reasons for not believing in a God aren't all that great. And then he's challenged by Dyson and Tolkien to look at the Bible. Now, I have to be careful I say this, to look at it as the greatest, truest myth that ever was. And you're thinking that doesn't make sense to us. When those two use the term myth, they meant in terms of meta narrative or large story. And I guess folks are trying to get a hold of me. I'm with you right now. So we're having our tea, just like C.S. Lewis would have. Um, Basically, what ends up happening here is what they mean by myth is they mean in terms of epic story. So Tolkien isn't stating the Bible's a myth in the sense of being untrue. He's saying it's the greatest story. I would say the meta narrative. And so he challenged C.S. Lewis to read his Bible. Really, that probably happened before 31. And so he comes to faith in 31, examining the story of Scripture, particularly probably the New Testament. We're going to see that Lewis had some problems with the Older Testament. Uh, his wife becomes kind of a fun story. Him explaining their courtship was absolutely amazing. Um, Joy Davidson Gresham. Notice I used her maiden name, not just Gresham. Okay, was a Jewish convert to Christianity. Now, that's really kind of neat to me. It's a Jewish convert to Christianity. I'm disappointed with that language. Uh, she is a Jewish Christian or a Messianic Jew. Probably at that point, the term Jewish Christian would have been more accurate in the sense that there weren't congregations of Jewish believers. There were in Europe a different sort of missionology developed and different sort of look to missions at the time, and that was true also in America. But she's a Jewish believer. Uh, she divorced her alcoholic husband, who, by the way, was fooling around and brought his mistress into the house. Okay, this is a bad situation. She had two sons, one of which helped produce the first Narnia film, which was done by Walton Productions. Um, William Gresham, her maiden name was Davidson, very nice Jewish name. She moves to Oxford. She's living in Oxford with the two boys because she does not want them in the house with the mistress and with the husband. Things are not good there. And so she corresponded with C.S. Lewis. He loved the correspondence. She basically tells him one day, "Guess where I am?" And he says, "Where?" And she says, "London." And so she's there for a number of years with the boys, and then she receives a letter from immigration that she's going to be deported. This sets the scene for the marriage of convenience that occurs. So they get a civil marriage, not a marriage in the church. She's presently divorced. The husband divorced her. They get a civil marriage, which allows her to stay in the country. Now, none of this is, I'm not saying go try this at home or anything. Okay? This is a very weird, unique situation, and the Anglican Church did not much like divorce. And I could understand that. But it allowed her to live in the UK. He visits her. In fact, the joke is that he visits her, and Warney basically wonders what the neighbors will think. And she finds it hysterically funny that they think that they're up to something when they're up to nothing. Um, and so they get terribly close, and they really love the dialogue. Um, No, the man who founded Chosen People Ministry, someone asked, came from Israel to the U.S. If you're looking for some incredible Jewish missions boards, they had Midway Missions to the Jews. If you've ever the commentaries of a brilliant Bible commentator and teacher, there was a man named David Barron who wrote a commentary on Isaiah 53. that is still a classic. Um, and the Church of England was very active in Jewish missions. Check out Alfred Erdeschine's The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah out of the Scottish Church. Uh, and so there was a strong missional aspect in the Scottish Church. That's just my little diversion on church mission history. Dr. Mitch Glazer's PhD dissertation was on Jewish missions, the history of Jewish missions. Absolutely brilliant piece of work. I.e. Zachava Glazer, who is brilliant in her own right, and I wish I had her as my dissertation editor. Um, well, I do and I don't, because she'd probably kind of shake her head at Jeff. Um, let's move on. Um, their description of courtship was fascinating. I used to feel bad because my wife reminds me of the way I proposed to her, and it was not the most romantic thing in the world. But Lewis has me topped for the least romantic um, proposal in the universe. So um, she ends up with cancer, bone cancer. And so basically, it's at that point that there's a discussion about marriage. They were married in the hospital room. However, this was not a civil ceremony, this was a religious ceremony. The minister came to the actual hospital bed. They were married. What he describes next is that they enjoyed an incredible 3 year remission, and then she died. And he went through a terrible period of grief. Uh, if you've seen the film Shadowlands, it's absolutely wonderful. Based on the book, he went through a terrible time reconciling that. Realized, too, it's the second female figure he had lost in his life, not including Mrs. Moore, so maybe the third. He loved the dialogue. He came to a place where he was grateful, and he stated that they had known more love in those 3 years than most couples know in a lifetime. They were like school kids. Now remember that she marries him at about the age of his 50s. How many people find a wonderful partner and enjoy married life in their 50s? Incredible. She dies in 1957. We're going to see that's interesting from his death in 63. So he lives essentially 6 years longer. Now let's look at the theology of C.S. Lewis for a while. Um, Norman Geisler wrote the Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics. It's available in your Logos library. Incredible book, very useful resource. I did not realize it had so much stuff on Lewis until I started doing the research for this show. I found whole new worlds of material in my stuff. He accepted what's called the Augustinian Absalom Aquinas view of God. What does that mean in English? God is eternal, necessary, transcendent, morally perfect, and personal. So that rules out pantheism. It rules out some other views. Now, by necessary, I mean in the sense that if there was going to be a universe, there would have to be a God. He's a non-contingent being. When we use the term necessary in philosophy, we mean non-contingent. He is dependent on nothing else. He is totally self-sufficient. C.S. Lewis's Baker's Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics, page 420, if you have the resource. Now, does that mean that he is got a problem with God's immanence? Now, that's important. See, Islam proposes a God that is transcendent but not very immanent, with the exception of the Sufi sect. God is nevertheless immanent, past and operating in creation. C.S. Lewis wrote, and this is a direct quote, notice the Christian Reflections reference. I've read almost all of C.S. Lewis's works, not his letters, though. God in the Dock, Out of the Silent Planet series, um, The Chronicles of Narnia. I think I've read Christian Reflections. The one that I've not read, that I know I've not read, is Till We All Have Faces. Lewis nevertheless believed essentially looking for God or heaven by exploring space is like reading or seeing all of Shakespeare's plays in the hope that you will find Shakespeare as one of the characters or Stratford as one of the places. Shakespeare is, in one sense, present in every moment in every play, but he's never present the same way as Falstaff or Lady Macbeth, nor is he diffused throughout the play like a gas. Now, notice what Lewis is saying. God is immanent in creation, but he's not a player in creation the same way that Falstaff is. Okay? He's playing in the play, but he isn't visible as a visible character in the play. Sort of like he's there, but he's not one of the characters directly. More like indirectly. In other words, he maintains his immanence, but he's still, his transcendence, but he's still very immanent and operating. Now, that was C.S. Lewis's view. How did he deal with different arguments for God's existence? Uh, Glad to see that there was a recently published collection of his letters. By the way, a reference to Jack, he felt his first name, Clive Staples, would hinder him in his upward mobility in life, and announced to his parents as a child that his name was Jackson, which later got shortened to Jack. So Jack has nothing to do with the name Clive or Clive Staples. Let's look at how he looked at different arguments for God for just a few seconds here. Um, God in the Dock, page 137. When God creates, what God creates is not God, just as what man creates is not man. He explained that matter is not co eternal with God, but he did accept, now this is where it gets a little weird, he did accept some sort of strange form of theistic evolution. But he did believe in creation out of nothing. See, some of C.S. Lewis' views, you know, are a little different. We'll talk about what we learned from that. Okay? Now, one of the things for Lewis is that entropy demands a creator. Um, and so, although it may be, although entropy exists, he talks about entropy, that's everything tends to wind down in the universe. Okay? And you see the thing up here. Um, Nature, which is running down, cannot be the whole story. A clock cannot run down unless it's been wound up. See that? Now that's key. Is a clock can't be wound down unless it's wound to begin with. Entropy, the universe is winding down. Therefore, it had to have an origin and starting point in which it was wound up. Therefore, it had to be created. But beyond that, and I really like this, he really opposed materialism, which, by the way, we need to really oppose. Materialism is the idea that the universe is just material and that's all there was or is. Matter is a product of cosmic mind. But to admit that there is some sort of cosmic mind is to admit a God outside of nature, transcendent and supernatural. I bid page 30, same material. The universe is matter. Matter cannot produce mind. Only mind can produce matter. That's key. There's a site called Inspiring Philosophy. And really, they're doing a lot of work in the issues of consciousness and the idea that our universe almost functions digitally. That one of the key ingredients of our universe is really key things that our universe has to have is mind. The creation of the world was not from pre existing matter or stuff, it was created from nothing. God created the world freely. The freedom of God consists in the fact that no other cause than himself produces his acts, and no external obstacle impedes them. Now, did you hear that? God's freedom is that he can freely choose, and there is nothing else outside of him causing his acts or nothing deterring them. So you and I don't have total freedom. Let's talk about his anthropology here. I thought this was going to be shorter, but we're really delving into Lewis's mind here, and I'm kind of pleased with that. Human beings are moral. Emphasis on the rational does not negate human emotions. Now, here's where he's going to really confront the thinking of his day. Those who put thinking above feeling are, for Lewis, men without chests. He uses that term, they're heartless, okay? Um, he uses that term in The Abolition of Man, page 34. The head rules the belly through the chest, the seat of emotions, organized and trained into habit trained by habit into stable sentiments. Without the middle element, man is vain, for by his intellect he is mere spirit, and by his appetite he is mere animal. Abolition of Man 34. Beyond his moral nature stands the an obtainable moral ideal. He didn't say obtainable by man, okay? And certainly not by fallen man. Lewis would agree with the sentiment that the primary value of education, listen to this, is education in primary values. Education fulfills its proper role and it cultivates value judgments to help perfect moral nature. Isn't that interesting in light of our educational system and its bankruptcy morally? Human beings are creative. Lewis believed in Christian aesthetics. That's very important. By the way, more about his grief during his wife is A Grief Observed, which I did read. Um, he also wrote The Problem of Pain, which I also read. Human beings are creative. He believed in Christianity's important contribution to aesthetics, the study and beauty, beauty and its study. He viewed God as the ultimate creator, and then man, bearing his image, was a creator also. I'm not going to take you through the list of all his books. He was incredibly prolific in his writings, and that's why I listed them, because between his letters and his writings, he was an incredibly prolific writer, something that I could not hope to equal because I'm a much better orator than I am a writer. Uh, Although I would like to take some of these broadcasts and maybe try to transcribe them because I would like to leave a written record because I love the written word and I love history. I'm just not as gifted with pen as I am with tongue. Lewis was gifted with pen. Human beings are immortal. Now, that's interesting in light of theistic evolution because how does the spirit evolve? It can't. It has to come. He was a dualist. He believed in matter and spirit. But Lewis affirmed humanity's eternal value. The affirmation springs from his belief that each person is made in God's image. That's terribly important. Why are we spiritual creatures as well as physical creatures? Because we're made in the image of God. To affirm, I love this material here, to affirm humanity while denying ultimate moral value does not affirm real human value. Secular humanists, Lewis believed, abolished rather than affirm humanity. That's why he wrote The Abolition of Man. And That Hideous Strength, which, by the way, I did read. It's part of the Out of the Silent Planet trilogy. In denying the human, immortal, moral, and godlike, now he means, the image of God, like nature of man, they deny personhood and sweep away the basis for treating individuals with ultimate respect. That is so key, and we can use that argument. If people aren't made in the image of God, then they don't have intrinsic value. Let's look at C.S. Lewis's version of the moral argument, which one of his key arguments that he loved to use, and that really pointed to the existence of God for him, and it's one of the arguments that I really love. An impersonal source cannot explain universal morality. Now, it doesn't mean everyone agrees on what's right and wrong. It means that human beings by nature make moral judgments. And we have a sense of morality that some things are just right and some things are wrong, regardless of where we are and what we are. Hmm. Well, that's interesting. Someone mentioned a science fiction novel I haven't read. Okay, let's look at it. Morality can't just be instinct. He's giving reasons why an impersonal source cannot explain universal morality. Morality can't be instinct. It can't be mere convention. Okay, so he rejected relativism, or the idea that morality is a social construct. That was nonsense to Lewis, and I think it's nonsense altogether. It can't be a law of nature. There's no law of nature that refers to morality, nor can it be mere imagination, because then wrong and right are merely imagined things and they aren't really wrong and right at all. A finite personal source can't explain universal morality, it could only explain personal morality. Why would this universally be true for everybody? Therefore, an infinite personal source explains universal morality. I love Lewis's construct here. Now, the argument from desire is really cool. This is an argument that I really didn't appreciate because I tend to be very rational, but there's an intuitive side there too, because I love patterns. And I began to see the brilliance of this in terms of pattern. Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A lion's hungry, there's food. A baby feels hunger, and there's food. A duckling wants to swim, and there's such a thing as water. Men feel desire, okay? That's why I said this isn't a kids program. I clicked that on the thing that I have to click in YouTube. So, well, there's such a thing as a way to rightly fulfill that. If I find myself desiring, if I find myself a desire which has no experience in this, that no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, it does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasure was never meant to satisfy it, only arouse it, to suggest the real thing. And that's the way C.S. Lewis viewed pleasure. It was a beautiful thing. It was an inn along the way, but it was never home. And so when he writes Narnia, there's the real Narnia that exists that is greater than the Narnia the kids saw, the ultimate Narnia. The very term Shadowlands is we're living in the Shadowlands. In fact, in the novels by C.S. Lewis, it's when the children die and they go to Aslan's real country. He says the story isn't ending, it's just beginning. And everything else was like a dream before the story begins. Lewis wasn't perfect. He had some problematic views. His view of a theistic evolution is problematic given the rest of his views. He had problems with some other areas in spite of Lewis's problems, his overwhelming value to Christian apologetics is incredible. Not everything in his views are compatible with evangelical Christianity. But he really did one of the finest critiques of naturalism in print. He defended the literal New Testament miracles, including the resurrection of Christ. However, he denied the literal nature of many Old Testament miracles. This is problematic for me because if the Old Testament falls, so does the New Testament. Jesus affirmed the literalness of the Old Testament miracles. What can we learn? Apologetics is vital. God commands it. I'm not going to take you through all these verses. Jude, and it should be chapter 1, verse 3. I'm sorry about that. Okay? It inverted the numbers. Jude says, I wanted to write you about our common faith, but it was necessary to contend earnestly for the faith once for all delivered to the saints. 1 Peter 3:15. Be ready to give an answer, an apologia for the hope that lies within you. Paul talks about defense in 2 Corinthians 10:5. God commands it. Reason requires it. Being made in the image of God means that human beings are reasoning creatures. The world needs it. A good apologist, anyway, those are the first thing we learn. Apologetics is vital. The second thing we learn is a good apologist is not necessarily a good theologian. Now, I've seen this over and over again. Um, um, William Lane Craig is a brilliant apologist. I've got some real problems with him being a good theologian at times. There are areas where he's not a good theologian. Okay? There's a temptation to view your theology through your apologetics instead of view your apologetics through sound theology. Craig is good, but there's some real problematic areas. Be careful of taking things at face value. All in all, being there on the anniversary of his death, he is an author and apologist I incredibly value. He is a great brother in the faith who contributed to the cause of Christ, and his writings are a rich treasure. Perfect? No. None of us, even the best of theologians of us, are perfect in our theology, but his contributions were manifold. And so this Thanksgiving, I'm thankful for the likes of a C.S. Lewis. And I'm also thankful for apologetics, but that's my blog. And when I get it up, I'll be posting that. I encourage you to go to our website and read some of the blogs. You'll find them interesting. They sometimes dovetail with these broadcasts, take things a little further in a different vein, and they're kind of fun. And so I would encourage those. Um, well, it looks like someone's called me on the phone. Like Lewis would say, I'm afraid Warney didn't come and bring the tea, this actor. Um, but I'm going to go ahead and get off. I'm not being rude. I'm just desperately curious as to who's called me. Uh, and what about? So I may have another divine appointment I need to take care of, but I deeply appreciate all of you. I will do a personal Thanksgiving, but I'm going to do a general happy Thanksgiving and thank you for being here. And just thank you all for being here. I may be someone related to speaking engagements, so.